There is a moment in American history that almost nobody talks about anymore. It didn't happen in Congress. It didn't happen in a courthouse. It didn't happen at a protest march. It happened on a stage, in a packed concert hall, in the middle of a song. A 29-year-old man from Hoboken, New Jersey, the son of an immigrant boxer and a midwife, put down his microphone, walked to the edge of that stage, and said something that would land him on an FBI watch list, cost him his record contract, nearly destroy his career, and earn him the lifelong hatred of some of the most powerful men in America. He told the truth. In 1947, America, that was a dangerous thing to do. His name was Frank Sinatra. And what he did that night, and what was done to him because of it, is one of the most extraordinary and forgotten stories in the history of American entertainment. To understand why what Sinatra did was so remarkable, you need to understand exactly what America looked like in 1947. The Second World War had just ended. The greatest generation had come home. America was the most powerful nation on earth, and everyone knew it. But beneath that triumphant surface, beneath the victory parades and the booming economy and the wide smiles on the covers of Life magazine, America was a country with an open wound that nobody in power wanted to talk about. Black Americans had fought and died for this country in staggering numbers. They had stormed the beaches at Normandy. They had fought in the jungles of the Pacific. The Tuskegee Airmen had flown over 3,000 missions and never lost a single bomber they were protecting. The 761st Tank Battalion had broken through Hitler's lines in the Battle of the Bulge. These men had given everything. And when they came home to a country that treated them like second-class citizens. In the South, they could not vote. They could not eat in the same restaurants as white Americans. They could not stay in the same hotels. They could not sit in the same sections of concert halls. They had risked their lives for a democracy that wouldn't extend that democracy to them. In the North, it was subtler, more polite. But the walls were just as real. And in the entertainment industry, the world that Frank Sinatra lived in, the rules were crystal clear. Black musicians could perform for white audiences. Black entertainers could make white people laugh and dance and cry. But they could not sit at the same table. They could not stay in the same hotels as their white colleagues. They could not walk through the front door of the clubs where they performed. This was the world. This was the way it was. And anyone in show business who wanted to keep working kept their mouth shut about it. Frank Sinatra had not been born into a world that taught him to keep his mouth shut. He grew up at 415 Monroe Street in Hoboken, New Jersey, a 3-story brick building in a neighborhood that was a living mosaic of immigrant America, Italians, Irish, Polish, Jewish, black. Everyone crammed together, everyone struggling together, everyone surviving together. His mother, Dolly Sinatra, was a force of nature. She ran an illegal abortion clinic out of her home, served as a Democratic Party ward boss, and raised her only son with the iron conviction that you spoke your mind, you fought for the underdog, and you never, under any circumstances, let anyone tell you that some people mattered less than others. His father, Marty, had fought his entire life against the assumption that Italian immigrants were somehow lesser. He had seen his own community discriminated against, mocked, treated as foreigners in the country they were helping to build. Frank Sinatra watched all of this. He absorbed all of it. And when he became famous, when he became the most famous entertainer in America, the man whose voice made teenagers lose their minds and grown women weep in their seats, he carried all of it with him onto every stage he ever walked onto. By 1945, Frank Sinatra was everywhere. His face was on the cover of every magazine. His records were selling millions. His radio show reached tens of millions of listeners every week. He was about to become a major Hollywood star. The world was at his feet. And then a phone call came from a high school principal in East Harlem. The principal's name was Leonard Cavello. He had spent 20 years trying to build Benjamin Franklin High School into something remarkable, a school in one of New York's most diverse and economically struggling neighborhoods, where kids of every background could get a real education and a real chance. Toy in October. 1945, racial tensions that had been building for months finally exploded. White students and black students were fighting in the hallways. The neighborhood around the school was on the edge of a full riot. The police didn't know what to do. The city government didn't know what to do. Leonard Cavello knew one thing. He needed someone those kids would listen to. He called Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra showed up the next day. No publicist, no camera crew arranged in advance, no carefully crafted statement prepared by a press team. Just Frank Sinatra in a suit, walking into a school auditorium packed with angry teenagers who were ready to tear each other apart. He stood up in front of them and he talked. Not a speech, not a lecture, a conversation. He told them about growing up Italian in Hoboken, about being called a wop and a dago and worse, about being told he didn't belong, that his kind weren't real Americans, that he should go back where he came from, about what it felt like to be looked at with contempt by people who had decided before they ever met you that you were less than them. He looked at those kids, white kids, black kids, kids who had been throwing punches at each other an hour earlier, and he said, "I've been here 4 times in the past 2 weeks. I'd like to come back and talk to you again. Will you let me?" The room was quiet. And then the applause started. The riot stopped. The New York Times ran the story on the front page. Newsreels of Sinatra at Benjamin Franklin High played in movie theaters across the country. Editorials praised him. Community leaders thanked him. Frank Sinatra was 29 years old, and he had just walked into a race riot and walked out with peace. But that was just the beginning, because Frank Sinatra wasn't finished. That same year, 1945, he narrated and starred in a short film called The House I Live In. It was 10 minutes long. It showed Sinatra taking a break from a recording session, stepping outside, and finding a group of white boys chasing a Jewish kid down the alley. He stops them. He talks to them. He asks them what they're doing and why. And then he sings. The house I live in, a plot of earth, a street, the grocer and the butcher and the people that I meet, the children in the playground, the faces that I see, all races and religions, that's America to me. The film won an honorary Academy Award. It won a special Golden Globe. It was shown in schools across the country. And it put Frank Sinatra directly in the crosshairs of J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover had been director of the FBI since 1924. He had been building secret files on American citizens, politicians, entertainers, activists, journalists for over 20 years. Hoover's worldview was simple and absolute. America was under threat. The threat came from communism. And communism expressed itself in any movement that challenged the existing social order. The existing social order included racial segregation. Therefore, in Hoover's mind, anyone who challenged racial segregation was, by definition, a communist sympathizer. Frank Sinatra had made a film calling for racial and religious equality. Frank Sinatra had spoken at labor union events. Frank Sinatra had supported progressive political candidates. Frank Sinatra had called out racism publicly and repeatedly. Hoover opened a file on Frank Sinatra. He would keep adding to it for the next 30 years. By the time it was finished, that file was over 2,000 pages long. 2,000 pages on a singer. Because Frank Sinatra kept saying things that J. Edgar Hoover didn't want said. And then came the concert. The exact night. The exact city. The exact words spoken. Accounts differ on certain details, as they always do when history is recorded by people with competing interests in how it's remembered. What we know is this. Frank Sinatra was performing. The house was packed. The crowd was overwhelmingly white, because in 1947, America, concert halls were overwhelmingly white by design, by law, or by suffocating social pressure. And at some point during that performance, Sinatra became aware of something happening in that room that he could not ignore. Members of his own entourage, black members of his road crew, his musicians, people who had traveled hundreds of miles alongside him to put on that show, were being told to move, to separate, to sit where they were told, in Frank Sinatra's house. He stopped the music, just like that, mid-song. The band went quiet. 2,000 people looked up from their drinks and their conversations and their programs, confused. Sinatra walked to the front of the stage, and he started talking. He didn't read from notes. He didn't have a prepared speech. He said what he saw and what he thought about what he saw and what he intended to do about it. He told that audience what was happening in their room right at that moment, to people who had helped build the show they were about to enjoy. He told them that he didn't care how far they had traveled. He didn't care how much they had paid for their seats. He didn't care about any of that. What was happening was wrong, and it was going to stop, right now, in this room, or the show was over. The room divided in seconds. Some people stood up and walked out. They had come to hear a singer, not a sermon. Who did this man think he was? He was a performer. He was there to entertain them, not to tell them how to think. "Good," Sinatra reportedly said as they left. He meant it. Some people stayed. Some people stayed and cheered. Some people stayed and sat in stunned silence, not entirely sure what they had just witnessed, but understanding in some deep part of themselves that they were watching something they would remember for the rest of their lives. Sinatra finished the show. For the people who stayed, in a room where everyone sat together. The reaction from the press was immediate and divided. In black newspapers, the Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Amsterdam News, Sinatra was celebrated as a hero. Letters poured in from across the country, from veterans who had fought in segregated units and come home to segregated neighborhoods, from mothers who had sons in those units, from communities that had never heard someone with that kind of platform say, in public, in front of a paying audience, that what was being done to them was wrong. In certain white newspapers, particularly in the South, but not only in the South, the coverage was very different. He was called a troublemaker, a communist, a man who didn't know his place. The fan mail that arrived at his management office began to include hate mail, death threats, letters that used language about what should happen to entertainers who forgot who paid their salaries. And the FBI, Hoover's FBI, was watching all of it, reading all of it, filing all of it. What happened to Frank Sinatra over the next 5 years is one of the most studied and debated episodes in entertainment history. In 1947, the year of the concert, Sinatra was at the top of the world. By 1952, he had lost his record contract with Columbia. His film contract with MGM had been terminated. His television show had been canceled. His radio show was gone. His voice, which had always been sensitive, was showing signs of serious strain. His personal life, the breakup of his marriage, his explosive relationship with Ava Gardner, was front-page tabloid news, and not in a sympathetic way. The most famous entertainer in America had become, in 5 years, almost nobody. How does that happen? Some of it was personal. The voice problems were real. The tabloid coverage was real. The chaos of his private life was real. But those who have studied the FBI files, the portions that have been released under the Freedom of Information Act over the decades since, see a pattern that is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Phone calls made to radio station program directors, not ordering them to drop Sinatra, just suggesting, just mentioning that certain of his associations might be worth considering, just wondering aloud whether a man with his political history was the kind of artist a family radio station really wanted to be associated with. Meetings with studio executives, not threatening, just informing, just sharing certain information from certain files that the FBI happened to maintain, just letting people know what the Bureau knew and letting them draw their own conclusions. This is how Hoover operated, not with jackboots and orders, with suggestions, with information, with the quiet, devastating implication that the Bureau was watching and that people who associated with certain individuals might find themselves watched too. Frank Sinatra believed, for the rest of his life, that Hoover had orchestrated his fall. The files support that belief. Not conclusively, not with a single smoking gun. But the pattern is there, for anyone willing to look. And then, from here to eternity, 1953, one of the greatest comebacks in the history of American entertainment. Sinatra begged Columbia Pictures for the role of Maggio, a small role, supporting far below what his previous star status would have demanded. He allegedly offered to work for almost nothing. The studio was skeptical. His career was in ruins. Who was going to pay to see Frank Sinatra? He got the role. He gave a performance that stopped audiences cold. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences gave him the Oscar for Best Supporting Actor. Frank Sinatra was back. A new record contract. Capitol Records, a new arranger. Nelson Riddle, a new sound. Darker, richer, wiser. The voice of a man who had been to the bottom and climbed back up and was going to tell you exactly what it looked like down there. In the wee small hours. Songs for swingin' lovers. Only the Lonely. A string of albums that are still, to this day, considered among the greatest recordings in the history of American popular music. The comeback Frank Sinatra, the chairman of the board, the man who owned every room he walked into for the rest of his life. But something had changed. The Frank Sinatra who came back in 1953 was still brilliant, still magnetic, still capable of devastating honesty in his music. But he was more careful. He still had black friends. He still refused to perform at venues that wouldn't admit black audiences. He still, in his own way, lived by a code that his Hoboken childhood had written into him. But he didn't stop concerts anymore. He didn't walk into high schools anymore. He didn't make films called The House I Live In anymore. He had learned what happened when you did those things. Was that wisdom? Was it survival? Was it surrender? Frank Sinatra never gave a clean answer to that question. In interviews over the years, he spoke about race with more care, more calibration than the young man from Hoboken who had stopped a concert and told an audience exactly what he thought of them. Whether that was because he had grown wiser, or because J. Edgar Hoover had successfully taught him a lesson about the cost of speaking plainly, is something only Frank Sinatra ever fully knew. Frank Sinatra died on May 14, 1998. He was 82 years old. He was buried in Desert Memorial Park in Cathedral City, California. In his pocket, placed there by his family, were 10 dimes, a pack of Cherry Lifesavers, a Zippo lighter, and a small bottle of Jack Daniels. The obituaries called him the greatest entertainer of the 20th century. They talked about the voice, the phrasing, the presents, the Rat Pack, the Oscars, the records. Almost none of them mentioned what he had done in 1945 at Benjamin Franklin High School. Almost none of them mentioned the concert where he stopped the music. Almost none of them mentioned the FBI file, the 2,000 pages, the 30 years of surveillance, the phone calls to radio stations, the career that was nearly destroyed because a singer had the nerve to say, in public, that all people deserve to be treated equally. Parts of that FBI file have been released, under the Freedom of Information Act, through lawsuits, through the slow grinding process by which America eventually admits to some of what it did. Parts of it are still classified, still redacted, still black lines across paragraphs that someone, to this day, has decided the American public doesn't need to read. A singer, dead for over 25 years. And there are still things in his FBI file that they won't show us. Think about what that means. Think about what must be in those pages. Think about what Frank Sinatra knew, and what was done to him, and what we are still not being told. In 1947, a 29-year-old man from Hoboken stopped a concert. He walked to the front of a stage in front of a paying audience and told them that what they were doing was wrong. He knew what it would cost him. He did it anyway. Not because it was safe, not because it was good for his career, not because his manager told him to, not because it was calculated, because he had grown up in a neighborhood where you looked out for each other, because his mother had taught him that some things were more important than staying in your lane, because he had a voice that millions of people listened to, and he understood in a way that very few people with that kind of platform ever do, that a voice like that comes with a responsibility, the responsibility to say something true, even when it costs you everything. What do you think? Oh, was Frank Sinatra the bravest man in American entertainment history? And what do you think is in those pages that are still classified, still hidden, over 25 years after his death? Tell us in the comments. And if you want more stories like this one, the nights when one person stood up, the files that are still sealed, the moments of courage that history decided we didn't need to remember. Subscribe to Behind Closed Doors, because we are just getting started.